Well, here comes everyone. Welcome. Welcome. It's so great to see everybody. And feel free to put where you're zooming in from in the chat if you'd like. I think we've got people coming from all over for today's reading. And welcome to the Poets Corner. We're going to just take a couple of minutes here while we admit people from the waiting room. I think we had over 3,000 people sign up for today's event. So it's just lovely to see all of you who've shown up. Oh, look at Washington, Jerusalem. Oh my goodness. Queens, New York, St. Andrews, New Brunswick, Colorado, Paris, Italy, Oregon, Arizona, Camden, Maine, Orkney, Scotland. I can't keep up with them all, but I feel like I'm traveling the globe. Tasmania, Santa Cruz, Victoria, British Columbia, Ireland, Staten Island, New York, cold South Jersey. Yeah, well, I'm in Maine and it's cold here too. But I think that Padraig's in New York today and Mark and Kayleen are out in California. So we've got the country covered. I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a very full program today. I'm Meg Weston. I'm the founder and host of the Poets Corner, and I want to welcome you all. For those of you who might be new to the Poets Corner, 2025 is the 5th anniversary of our founding, and it's the 5th reading Rilke conversation we've had with Mark Burrows. I believe that Pádraig has been with us every one of those years, and Kayleen is new in our conversation this year. 5 years ago, I could never have imagined the Poets Corner to be what it is today, the size and scale. We have over 8,000 people in our community from all over the world. We've hosted more than 60 of our free Sunday reading series, which hosts emerging writers as well as more well-known poets and writers such as Jane Hirshfield, Ellen Bass, Billy Collins, Arthur C., Mark Doty, Diane Seuss, and so many others. But this is our most popular program of the year, this annual Rilke event. And of course, the Poets Corner is a labor of love, funding out of pocket, and your donations are always welcome. You can do that on our website, thepoetscorner.org. I want to thank Lucas Adair, who is our incredibly competent technical host since the start. And if you have technical issues, you can feel free to text the host in the chat and ask for help. And the very talented Liz Collick, who joined us as our strategy and design director about a year ago. So I want to say a few words about upcoming events, and then I'll turn the program over to Mark Burrows. Our 2026 Camden Festival of Poetry will feature as our keynote the poet and essayist Amy Nizuku-Matato. There's a podcast on the website, camdenfestivalofpoetry.org, called Poetry Medicine for the Soul, and I'm reading two of Amy's poems and talking about them. I encourage you to check it out and listen to it. And definitely, if you can, plan a trip to Camden next May, May 12th through the 16th. And because Liz and I are a dangerous combination when we put our heads together, we have a lot of new programs for you on the Poets Corner next year. We'll begin January with our first poetry book review posted on thepoetscorner.org. And look for this new feature, a book review every month in 2026. Also in January, we'll kick off the third of our biannual chapbook contest. An opportunity to enter will be posted soon on our website. This year's judge is Amy Nizuku Matato. The winner receives a $1,000 prize, publication by Toad Hall Editions, a reading in June on the Poets Corner, and 10 copies of the printed chapbook. Submissions open January 2nd. Our Sunday reading series will host Mark Burrows again on Sunday, January 11th, this time with Donna Spruce-Metz, reading from her new book, To Phrase a Prayer from Priests for Peace. You can sign up now, and that's free. On January 25th, we have a program called Rupture and Repair with Catherine Larson and Miho Nonaki, hosted by poet Jefferson Navicki. Catherine's new book, called Wedding of the Foxes, is a book of lyrical essays about the current environmental crisis. And this program requests a donation. You don't have to, but you can, to benefit the Millay House in Rockland, where Edna St. Vincent Millay was born. On Thursday evening, January 22nd, we have a craft talk with Kristen Lindquist, a writer, naturalist, and avid birder, entitled Haiku is for the Birds. And she'll explore the ancient form of haiku through the lens of bird haikus. It will be followed by a workshop on February 5th with those who want feedback and to work with her on their own haiku poetry. And on February 12th, Mark Burrows will be back again for a craft talk entitled The Outward Gaze, Rilke, Rodin, and the Conversation Between Poetry and Sculpture. Once again, this will be well worth your while. You'll want to sign up now. Our craft talks require a small fee, and it's worth it. So now on to today's reading. I'll introduce Mark, and I'll allow him to introduce our other guests. By now, Mark probably needs absolutely no introduction to this audience, but I'm going to try because he lives right here in Camden, Maine, even though he's zooming in today from California. He's my neighbor, my good friend, and my co-founder and co-director of the Camden Festival of Poetry. He's just returned from a tour of Australia and before that in Europe, where he's very in demand as a speaker and workshop leader. He's a Rilke scholar and an award-winning translator of Rilke's poetry with several books of his poetry and about Rilke. Two published in 2024 include a new translation of Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus, and You Are the Future, Living the Questions with Rainer Marie Rilke, written with Stephanie Dowrick. He's a poet, a warm and wonderful teacher and leader, and I'm so thrilled to have him lead this session today on the Poets Corner. Thank you, Mark.
Oh, thank you so much, Meg, and a warm welcome to all of you. As Meg mentioned, I happen to be in Northern California at the moment, and it's beautiful weather here, sunny and warm. Wherever you are, whatever the temperatures, a very warm welcome to you. It's a great joy to be together again this year, as for the last 5 years, joined by my friend and colleague, Pádraig Ó Tuama, probably also needs no introduction. But let me introduce Pádraig and Kayleen Asbo briefly, and we'll turn to Pádraig to lead off this afternoon's session. But first, a word about Rilke, because this is the celebration, the 150th year celebration of his birth on December 4th, 1875. And next year will mark the centenary of his death. He died in late December, December 29th, 1926. We started this program not to talk about Rilke as much as to engage in a conversation with Rilke's poems and writings. And in some sense, Rilke is a poet for these times. He's a soul mentor. He's somebody who spoke about the heart work that's needed in his times and indeed in ours as well. He reminded us to cherish the questions and to live everything, to live the questions until we find our way towards some tentative answer, but to engage the here-ness, the now-ness of our lives as a place of adventure, a place of discovery, a place of a startling beauty that comes upon us sometimes in a hidden moment, in a quiet phrase, in an image that we stumble upon in his own writings and follow his own astonishments at the journey in the darkness toward light, toward the light that's always with us. Well, to join me this year, once again, Pádraig, it's a great joy to have you with us. Pádraig is an Irish poet, theologian, essayist. His interests are wide-ranging, deeply concerned about the question of peace and reconciliation, not only in his context in Ireland, but around the world. Many of you will know Pádraig from his remarkable podcast through the On Being studio called Poetry UnBound. And if you haven't found your way to his two recent books, then you're missing treasures. Kitchen Hymns, which is one of the most astonishing collections of poetry I've read, perhaps in my life. I mean, it's just a remarkable exploration of the deepest and most intractable questions, the mysteries of beauty in the midst of banality and horror and violence, a groping for a sense of a light that can hold us and carry us in dark times like these. So Kitchen Hymns, and then 44 poems on being with each other. Another gem of a book, the second in the collection of these Poetry UnBound series. Many of you will remember the first one came out several years ago. So Pádraig, it's a wonderful gift to have you with us again. You're in the middle of the Irish Poetry Festival in New York City, and you broke away from the last session to spend this time with us. Pádraig will be followed by Kayleen Asbo, who is a friend and will be known to many of you. She's a composer, a teacher, a poet, a soul mentor, I would say. She founded some years ago the Mythica Foundation, which is a kind of online community that brings people together through the vehicles of poetry and music and art into the deep questions of our spiritual journey. So with that said, Pádraig, over to you to get us started today on reading Rilke today, and a warm welcome.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you to Meg as well, and Kayleen, and everyone on the Poets Corner, and everyone who's here. It's such a lovely thing to be part of this annual celebration. I was 50 earlier on this year, so I am 100 years younger than Rilke. So once I realized that, it was suddenly very easy to remember the year of his birth. I so enjoy this because Rilke is one of those poets where it's easy to have strong feelings about him, but it's difficult to know how to speak about his output, his artistic life, his aesthetic, his prose, his wide-reaching imagination, easily because there's so much of it and there are so many scholars. So I am in this room as somebody who is moved by his poetry, and that's how I'm going to speak. Mark is such a scholar of the translation and the life of Rilke, and has written and published so much and taught so much in such a helpful way. But I give myself permission, and all of us permission, to be here as people who are fond of and moved by and intrigued by and confused by and drawn into all of this work of Rilke. So let us be drawn in. I wanted to start with a little quote, which is not from Rilke, but it's been on my mind as I've been preparing some poems for us to think about. It's from Emily Dickinson. She says, "Wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not." Extraordinary. Wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not. That seems to me to be a door that goes on a double hinge, one way and then the other, back and forth, and something strange is occurring. There's a giving, there's a not knowing, and with the not knowing comes a not knowing not. And I think that there's something that both of them, that Emily Dickinson and Rilke, were tuned into in the human condition, of its capacity for letting go of something in order to be able to see something else. So with that, let's have a look at some poems. I'm going to look at two poems, and I'm going to put them up on the screen so you can follow it along. There. Mark, could you give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Because I can see you. There you are, I have your Mark's thumbs up. So this is from The Annunciation. It's translated by Franz Wright. This is from the letters from the life, this is from The Life of Mary, which was published in 1913. The Annunciation. It isn't just that an angel entered. Realize this is not what startled her. She might have been somebody else, and the angel some sunlight, or at night the moon occupying itself in her room. So quietly she accustomed herself to the form he took. She barely suspected that this kind of visit is exhausting to angels. Oh, if we knew how pure she was. Didn't a deer, catching sight of her once in the forest, lose itself so much in looking at her that without coupling it conceived the unicorn, the animal of light, the pure animal? It's not just that he walked in, but that he placed the face of a young man so close to hers. His gaze and the one with which she answered it blended so much, suddenly, that everything else vanished, and what millions saw, built, and endured, crowded inside of her, only her and him, seeing and seen, eye and whatever is beautiful to the eye, nowhere else but right here. This is startling. And it startled them both. Then the angel sang his song. I feel like we could just read this 20 times and just be caught up into the music, the introduction, the culmination of that beautiful music as that line goes on. Like, look at the length of this delicious line of poetry here. Oh, it goes on and builds and builds and builds. And then the way within which these three gorgeous words, with the enjambment here, as Franz Wright has put it, this is startling. And it startled them both. We have begun with what startled her. And so the poem, in a certain sense, allows us to anticipate that this is going to be about what it was like for Mary to be startled by whatever is going to occur. And then we have this recognition here, and it startled them both. This is such a turn that you see so frequently in Rilke's poetry, that the question of the relationship to the beyond, the l'au-delà, as they say in French, not that he was writing in French, but the hereafter, that which is on the other side of the plane, all these different ways we have to let language move us and point us beyond language, that what happens in that is reciprocal. And I don't think I don't know enough to speak about Rilke's theology, but I certainly can speak to having read so many of his poems that are addressed to some kind of divine you It is a divine you that is made and co-created in the shared gaze between the looked at and the looking. And something happens that changes and draws us all into this. And we see this happening here so elegantly in the relationship between the Mary here and the angel. And then we see the angel, we hear the angel's song. But what's so interesting is that the lyric of this text has already brought us into a song. We are right in the music already. And so when the angel sang his song, the angel too is responding to something that we as the reader have been hearing. Each has changed. And what's so interesting is that there's this question as to, the angel didn't startle her. In a certain sense, it kind of implies that Mary was totally used to the idea of angels, because we've heard earlier on, look at this extraordinary thing, which we'll come to, this apostrophe, this aside in brackets here. And what's so beautiful is that what we hear is that the possibility of this arrival can come in day or night, some sunlight, or at night the moon occupying itself in her room. There's something so nice about that, where he is not just saying, well, the daytime is the time for such beautiful things and the nighttime is for the opposite. He's saying all time is all time in the generosity of this moment. The unknown tasks of moonlight. How beautiful to think about how it is that the moonlight is occupying itself in her room. Just the characterization that's happening here. The next time that you're awake at night and you see street light or moonlight or any kind of light, a night light, something coming from the light of your alarm clock, wonder what it is that it's doing to occupy itself in your room, and see what happens in your conversation between you and whatever kind of light it is that you notice. That's a nice way to spend the middle of the night hours if you happen to be somebody like me who spends a lot of them awake. I want to speak, I'm going to look at 2 poems, and I want to speak of this aside in the parentheticals here in the brackets, and especially this, the O. What is the O? It's the beginning of music, of course. So obviously there's been music already in the glorious words of Rilke. I'm sure Mark will be able to speak to us about how rich the German is. Everybody who speaks German says that Rilke does something in German that nobody else had been able to do in German up until that point, and changed German in a certain sense. And you see it happening in English too, with the glorious translations that Mark does and so many other people do too. Oh, if we knew how pure she was. And then we have this fantastical scene. There's a marking of time, there's a glade. And to truly see, can mean that something utterly unique can occur. The deer caught sight of Mary, and without coupling it conceived the unicorn, the animal of light, the pure animal. Here, of course, what Rilke is making reference to is the idea of the virgin birth. But by moving away from the idea of a theological formulation, talking about the deer and the unicorn, the animal of light, the pure animal, it lifts us into the great mythology that occurs and reoccurs and reoccurs all the time in so many of the world's mythologies, regarding that something can somehow be generated from seemingly nowhere. It comes from nothing, and yet the nothing is the very place from which it comes, and that is a generative space. Perhaps it's like art, perhaps it's like music, perhaps it's like love, perhaps it's like the yearning of the heart, that these are all echoes, it seems, of what it is that can occur. This is so interesting when we look here. It's not just that he walked in, but that he placed the face of a young man so close to hers. Who is that young man? I mean, it's almost like we're speaking about the angel, and that the angel formulates himself in the face of a young man. Is this a foreshadowing of the Christ? Or is this a way of Rilke trying to speak about the young man that he was, the boy that he was, the griefs that he carried? Is this a way of him trying to speak of, in a limited way when it comes to gender, but trying to speak of the every person? We don't know. His gaze and the one with which she answered. Again, you see, it isn't just his gaze and her gaze, but Rilke says so clearly, the one with which she answered, that somehow it's saying that the gaze is a reply, and that the gaze can change and change and change. And something happens. Suddenly, everything else vanished, and what millions saw, built, and endured. The word endured here allows us to see that this is not just a beatific vision, this is also about the difficulties of life. Rilke, of course, knew coming into the 20th century, he, in his Book of Hours, he felt the weight of the oncoming century rather than, oh, it's going to be blissful. He seemed to know how to feel the weight of it and to feel it tenderly with grief, with anticipation, with beauty, with lament, all of there. We see the irony, crowded inside of her, and then only her and him. How can something be crowded and can it be only also? There we have it, the two together, and in the two, the space for the many. The Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen said, to turn from everything to one face is to find oneself face to face with everything. To turn from everything to one face is to find oneself face to face with everything. A modernist writer. And we see here the same idea that somehow inside of her, only her and him, but somehow there is also so much else there. Seeing and seen, the eye and whatever is beautiful to the eye, nowhere else but right here. And that this is startling. The great scholar of the lyric address in poetry, William Waters, speaks about poetry as a form of contact. That's one of the things he said poetry is, a form of contact. And this poem really praises contact. And you see the way within which language, it's not that language fails, but it is that language somehow gets to the edge of itself and allows itself to be lifted into music when it's not trying to be too definitive about what's happening. He placed the face of a young man so close to hers, his gaze and the one with which she answered. Those very technical formulations just allow us to feel the strangeness about what's occurring. And in the strangeness, so much can be given hospitality. He isn't trying to define it perfectly. I think it's a beautiful thing that he does. We've gotten an indication early on that somehow this exchange with the angel is a different kind of exchange than we might be used to if you're used to reading certain scriptural ideas. She barely suspected that this kind of visit is exhausting to angels. What a lovely idea to think of the tiredness of angels. But look at this kind of visit. What we see here is that it's implying this can occur multiple times. This isn't just a once-off, that somehow too it can occur to you, that maybe an angel will be exhausted in coming to you. And what kind of startlement can occur in the space between you and the angel? That might be poetry, that might be music, that might be the love of another, that might be a muse, that can be all kinds of things that can occur at the same time. The other poem I want to look at is from Uncollected Poems and Fragments. This is, again, is a translation by Franz Wright, much shorter. The title of it here is just taken from the first line. We're drawn to what is unaware of us, to trees which slumberously tower beyond us, to any being for itself, to any keeping silent. But this is really how we close the circle which flows through all we can't possess and back again into us, forever healing. Oh, things! To think you stand so near the stars. We live on, and we have done no harm. There's the question of the gaze. There's the question of attention here. But in this instance, it's not an angel. But the example he gives in the second line, to trees, which slumberously tower beyond us. How gorgeous, slumberously. And tower. There's something, again, there's great irony in the sense of something that's slumbering but towering. So there's great power, but also a composure, a state of rest when we think of slumberously here. And then it goes into like phenomenology, to any being for itself, and then to any keeping silent. This is not random, though. There's something so interesting in the sense of this is how we close the circle. This thing that we're drawn to is unaware of us, but in connection with it, a circle is closed and flows through all we can't possess and back again into us, forever healing. There's such interesting understanding about attachment to the ego I can see many people who might have a very particular practice in Buddhism feeling like, oh, he's describing something that I've been holding here, that the idea of firm attachment is always going to lead to grief, and that somehow the letting go, the letting go, the letting go, and the giving of the gaze to something that you don't own and that doesn't own you somehow creates a connection back again into us, forever healing. How beautiful that there is a circle of breathing, a circle of life, and a circle of the present moment now. We know that we are what Emily Dickinson calls finite infinitude. We know we're going to die, and we know that somehow we have the imagination of the infinite in us, or at least the question or the thought or the pondering about time, and the self-consciousness about time. And this, I think, is evoked here. I love the apostrophe here. The apostrophe in poetic terms is the turning aside in this 7th line of the poem. Oh, things, to think you stand so near the stars. What an interesting thing. How can you stand so near the stars? Again, great irony. Sure, a tree, if it is a tree, it might be 100 feet tall, but that's not really near the stars somehow. I don't think he's just saying it's taller than I am. There is somehow this connection into the great beyond that's happening. It's almost like the Platonic ideal that's happening. And it's a hymn here that's speaking about a place of encounter. Oh, things. He begins to address it directly. Up until now, it's the we are, we are, we are. And then, oh, things. He deliberately addresses that which he is speaking to, the tangible object which points to the intangible, to think that you stand there. It's aware, it's unaware. That's in the title. We're drawn to what is unaware of us. But is this thing that we're drawn to aware of something else? I suppose that's one of the questions. And what is it aware of? And somehow, if that is aware of something, that we can look to it and through it and be drawn into the generative gaze that's coming back to us, perhaps that's one of the questions. But what's so interesting, especially in the integration that's being proposed here, how we close the circle, is that Rilke is saying that even though it may not be aware of us, or that it is unaware of us, that somehow it is not unattuned to us, that there is an attunement at the heart of things, at the heart of the spirituality, at the heart of the gaze, at the heart of language, and at the heart of a deep, deep devotion. The last thing I'll say is that the O here of the apostrophe, in the turning aside, oh, like that is where language reaches into music. Our voice just becomes pure sound, even for the ecstatic small moment of that vowel sound, what it does in our throats. Oh, that it is reaching into music. And in the music there is celebration, of course, there's joy, there's space for lament too. And that the pure sound of our own voice might be the only thing that carries us across the chasm. The O, I think, recognizes that there's some things for which we have no proper words, but all we can do is let breath escape from us. The breath that we've taken in is released in the address, the hymnotic sound of the O. Let me pass over to Kayleen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pádraig. Nowhere else but right here. Nowhere else but right here. Those words from Rilke. Kayleen, onward and forward with you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Pádraig, for just a beautiful invitation to go more deeply into the poems, to take us into the heart of what you saw, and with your beautiful questions to entice us to go deeper into the mystery. I actually wanted to start with this image of the Burghers of Calais by Rodin, a figure who is so important to Rilke, because for me, it's one of the images that holds grief so powerfully. The sculpture is about these men in medieval France who were knowingly about to face their own death, and how each one was facing it individually, and yet somehow there was this collective at the same time. Rodin used some of the same faces again, some of the same hands, some of the same feet, so that there was this paradox of aloneness and togetherness. And that, for me, is one of the paradoxes that Rilke holds, is that he is inviting us so often into solitude. Solitude was so important to him. And yet at the same time that he does that, his words craft this space for the most profound intimacy. And my first truly meaningful encounter with Rilke was actually at a grief ritual, a 3-day retreat in which people were coming with all kinds of sorrows as they were facing death, as they were grieving the death of a loved one, as they were in the midst of divorce or just wrestling with depression and agonizing loneliness. And the retreat wove Rilke's words throughout the weekend, so that by the end we felt not strangers at all, but the most intimate connection with one another. And his words became a key and a portal to unlock these incredibly tender bonds between us. They became a key in which to open up our ability to be with what is, to be with whatever was in our depths. I think par excellence, what Rilke is the poet of the depths. And I will never forget this poem being read on the opening night, because it really was this key that just helped us begin to crack open, both to our own sorrows and to a deeper level of compassion with one another. This particular translation is by Robert Bly, and it's from part 3 of the Book of Hours, written during the same year that he really began his relationship with Rodin, writing a book, a monograph about his work in which he actually talks about the burghers of Calais. And so for me, these are twinned together. Pushing through. It's possible I am pushing through solid rock in flint-like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I see no way through and no space. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief. So this massive darkness makes me small. You be the master, make yourself fierce, break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. Oh, such a poem. I still feel it in my body, the resonance of this night and this circle of 30 people who were locked in their own stony places of grief, and yet this key, this poem, shows that there's as solitary as we may feel, there is this possibility. There's this possibility that if we go deep enough and we reach out to each other, that we can break through the walls and find something that's really real. And in that really real, even if it's really hard, even if it's difficult, even if it's suffering, there's something about that really real that is absolutely liberating. So there's so many pieces to this poem, these themes, the massive darkness. So much of Rilke's poem is this invitation into the darkness. And this sense that somehow this relationship with the stone, I hope you can feel it, that sense. Have you been locked in grief? Has it been a place where you have been frozen in a stony place? What have been the things that have helped you break through, or has someone else broken in? The relationship between tenderness and fierceness. And this soul cry, I think so much that Rilke is this guide to the underworld. So much of what our world has pushed away are the shadows, are the darkness, are the feelings of vulnerability and helplessness. And I will always remember this weekend led by Francis Weller, in which those very things became the things that were liberating and also binding us to one another. The next thing that I encountered after that weekend was I sought out the letters to a young poet. And I just want to put a shout out to Mark Burrows' wonderful book that he wrote with Stephanie Dowrick called The You Are the Future, Living the Questions. And if you're new to Rilke, this would be a marvelous book to get because it takes his writing and it also invites you to locate Rilke as a mirror, to dive deeply into your own process. And one of the things then that is quoted in this is this line from Letters to a Young Poet. To live as an artist in your understanding and creative life depends on letting each impression and each seed of a feeling come to completion entirely in itself, in the dark, in the unsayable, in the unconscious, beyond the reach of one's understanding. I was struck rereading this line about how if you just changed a few words, it could have been written by the great depth psychologist Carl Jung. To become an individuated being depends on letting each image and each seed of a feeling come to completion in itself, in the dark, in the unsayable, in the unconscious, beyond the reach of one's understanding. And I'm so grateful to Mark for this invitation to be part of this, because in re-immersing myself in both treasured poems that I had known before and reading new translations and reading biographies, I just realized that Rilke is going to be a thread that I'm going to be following the rest of my life. And one of those threads will be the parallels between Carl Jung, who was born in the very same year that Rilke was, and Rilke himself. And that what Carl Jung would call individuation, becoming truly yourself, was something that Rilke was deeply, deeply important to him. He talks in one of his poems about how everyone wears a mask, and he really sought to go beneath the mask to see what was underneath that in this shadowland. And so much of both his life and his work has to do with holding these tension of the opposites, which lead to the numinist, and wrestling with those shadows and wrestling with the God image and with that sense of paradox. And in staying true and staying faithful to the paradox and having patience, as he writes over and again to Franz Xavier in Letters to a Young Poet, in staying with that mystery, with the unknown, with the unsayable, there's a ripening that happens. It's not that we get better. It's not that we get perfect. That's not the aim. It's this idea to ripen within. And so the other poems that I'd like to look at today are the poems that speak about two things, the real and the ripening. And in so doing, when we can learn to see and be seen, then we ripen into the real. And that really was his quest. I want to be a real person among real things, he writes in his letter to Luandris Salome. And if you don't know this book of their letters, oh, by all means get it. It is just such an extraordinary volume. And she, his muse, in some ways his mentor, this extraordinary woman, who we might talk about a little bit more later, but probably not, but who deserves whole courses on her. He describes her as being dwelling in ripeness and restfulness, who knows how to hear everything. And they were drawn together in their own paradoxical journey because they were wrestling. They were wrestling with images of God, and they wanted to find their way into a place of harmony, of deeper questioning. So Lou wrote Jesus the Jew, Rilke wrote Visions of Christ. And they were wrestling with the paradox of Christ themselves. And as part of their great spiritual quest, they went to Russia, Lou's homeland, and they encountered so many things that just filled their senses with images, with a sense of mystery. They went to monasteries, they met peasants, they met the great Leo Tolstoy. And that word paradoxes and symbols, those words that were so important to Jung in his quest for individuation, come up in this poem that Rilke wrote after that journey. He who reconciles the many paradoxes of his life and grasps them gratefully in a symbol, drives the noisy crowd from the palace and celebrates differently. And you're the guest he receives on soft evenings. You're the second in his solitude, the quiet center of his soliloquies, and every ring drawn around you spans for him the circle out of time. I love Mark's translation of this. This first part of what became the Book of Hours was really to envision and imagine the life of a monk, an iconographer. Rilke had been a student of art history when he met Lou. And the idea of evoking an experience, Rilke writes that, he doesn't just want his books to be, his poems to be felt or thought of. He wants them to be experienced. So I'm going to read it again, and I'm going to invite you to imagine yourself as a monk, as an iconographer living in a monastery in Russia. And the hours refers to the divine office, which calls the faithful to prayer with the bells 7 times a day. Sometimes they would meet together. Sometimes it would be the monk alone in his solitary cell. And so as I read it, I just invite you to close your eyes. Close your eyes. And know when I'm saying the word you with a capital Y, it's the way that Rilke addresses God. You. So intimate. You. And feel the quality of Rilke just bringing us ever nearer to this you. He who reconciles the many paradoxes of his life and grasps them gratefully in a symbol, drives the noisy crowd from the palace and celebrates differently. And you're the guest he receives on soft evenings. You're the second in his solitude, the quiet center of his soliloquies, and every ring drawn around you spans for him the circle out of time. Silence was so important, and that's one of the great paradoxes, is that so many of Rilke's words are to reach towards and point towards what happens in silence in the depths of the human heart, and that what happens there in this place, in this deeply interior place that Rilke invites us to, is a different kind of joy, a different kind of celebration, a union, a nearness. And in this Book of Hours, I just love how there's not one fixed image of God. There is instead a whole series of fluid images that are dreamlike in some ways that Rilke invites us to. He was trying to get to a real numinous experience beyond the confines of the dogma he had inherited from his mother's Catholicism, just as Lou was trying to break free from her experiences of more rigid religion, to really have an encounter with a capital E. And as part of this volume, then, Rilke talks about God as the neighbor that he wants to, in the next room, that he wants to bring a glass of water to, or some of the anthropomorphic images of God having a beard, but he wants to comb the hair of his beard. God the friend, almost like Rumi addresses God. So intimate. This is a picture of Lou and Rilke in Russia. And another, some people have called Rilke a panentheist because eventually his way of seeing was to behold the sacred in everything, that God could be so near as our own breath, but also could be found in anything if we learned how to see, if we learned how to gaze. Just one second. There we are. And so now God becomes a tree. With a branch which was never like that one, God the tree will eventually come, announcing summer and murmuring with ripeness, in a land where people lean closer to hear, where everyone is just as lonely as I. For this will be revealed only to the solitary, and even more will be given to many others who share this solitude than to the poor one. For to each a different God appears until they recognize close to tears that through their wide open pondering, through all their knowing and negating, differing only among his hundreds, one God wanders like a wave. This is the most definite prayer. This is the most definitive prayer that those keeping watch declare. God, the root, has borne fruit. Go forth and shatter the bells. We come to the quieter days in which the hour stands ripe. God, the root, has borne fruit. Be earnest and watch. I love how in this song, the last part feels like a song, the part that is, italicized. I can just imagine the bells ringing and then the silence that comes after that. I mean, this begs for a musical score. Maybe that's what I'll do this year, is try to create a musical score for it. But I love how what he's doing here is echoing and evoking the New Testament when Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. But here, God is the root and we are the fruit. And what is it for us to ripen? And what is it for God to ripen? That God comes murmuring in ripeness too. Not a static, fixed figure at all, but something that grows and evolves in relationship with us. And when that happens, when we come to the quieter days, time itself stands ripe. And we're invited to that place of beholding, of really seeing the real and being able to encounter through the gaze something truly extraordinary. And once again, when we do that, there's this paradox of solitude, yes, but sharing solitude. To be in solitude together, just as monks in their own cells, listening to the bells toll, on their knees, praying the same prayers, each individually and yet somehow bound in a circle of intimacy. I highlighted that word watch because, again, it's so important in his journey of seeing. He writes to Lou in one of those letters that everything that is truly seen must become a poem. And I'm just going to say just a couple of words, and I hope that all of you will come, as I will come, to Mark's talk in February on Rilke and Rodin, a man that he called Master Rodin. Their relationship is utterly fascinating. But just an image of Rilke next to Rodin on the grounds of Rodin's home, where Rilke lived as his private secretary, taking dictation, but also with these images, also having breakfast with him, working all day in this studio, wandering around, observing the plaster cast, the molding, the shaping of clay, the dust of things on the ground, and then sitting by a pond at night with 3 swans, watching the sunset. And how Rodin taught him how to see the holy in everything, and the sculptures of Chartres and Reims Cathedral where they went on excursions, but also in the jaguar, the panther, at the zoo, in the Jardin des Plantes. And those images blossomed, ripened into poems. And maybe for you, they will be poems that become ever more meaningful, as they have for me, the more I know about Rilke and the paradoxes that he held. This process of in-seeing, that where 2 hands could be the same thing in their essence as Chartres Cathedral. If we really could see to the essence of things, if we could see to the really real. And that journey to see the really real began with a journey of grief for me. For Rilke too, it began in grief and then turned into a song that encompassed profound joy, which I think is what Mark might be talking about in the Sonnets to Orpheus.
Oh, thank you so much, Kayleen. What a gorgeous exploring of how grief brings us into the depth of who we are. And it opens us to something that we share in common with every other creature, human and otherwise, this longing for life and this facing of darkness when it comes. Well, I want to round off our time, and then we'll have a conversation together, the three of us, in a moment, by looking very briefly. I'm hoping that you can see this. I can't see you on the screen, so I'm imagining you can. Pay attention to what
We
arises.
can't see it yet.
Okay. Sorry about that. Hold on a minute. Am I sharing screen here? Oh, here we go. There we go. Sorry about that.
Yep,
Here we go.
got it. Thanks.
Thanks. This line from Rilke, pay attention to what arises within you. We'll get to this in a moment. But I think one reason, and Pádraig, you brought this so beautifully forward in your reflection on these two poems, and Kayleen in such a different way, but touching on the same depths, that what touches us, what brings us back to Rilke again and again, is the way that he brings us into the center of who we are, into our hearts, what he described as our heart work. And he once wrote that we transform the world from within our hearts, which is something so out of sync with the way that we often think, that we have to change the world outside of us in order to bring about any kind of meaningful newness. And Rilke was adamant in saying, no, the deep work has to begin within each one of us. And the way that we move into that change shifts the world. It transforms the world we live in. In an early diary from his trip to Italy, which happened just before he went to Russia, he'd fallen in love with Lou and spent a period of time living together intensely, day and night. They were together for about 3 years, never out of each other's sight, pretty much. And when he went to Florence, he had hoped to go with Lou, but he promised his mother that he would go with her. It must have been a bit disappointing. The great artist goes to Italy with his mom. Anyway, that's another story. But he kept a marvelous diary, in part because of Lou's urging that he do so. And in a remarkable moment in that early diary, he's 23 years old. He writes this, the artist's way. And he would have said, this is everyone's way. This is your way. The artist's way is this, to bridge one obstacle after another, to build step by step until she is able to gaze into herself, not stressing, not forced on tiptoes, but quietly and clearly, as if gazing into a landscape. After discovering this homecoming into herself, deed after deed will become a leisurely delight. Her life becomes a creation. And she no longer needs things outside herself. She is spacious, with room within for every ripening. Again, that notion of ripening. In the sense that this is, again, something that happens in our encounter with Rilke's writings, with his poems, with his letters, with his journals, is a sense of remembering that we each carry a spaciousness within us. No matter how confined our life may appear on the outside, in our day-to-day lives, we have this capacious heart that is a place of turmoil and growth, of suffering and rejoicing. And for Rilke, those things are always woven together. They're never pulled apart. That suffering is always part of joy, and darkness is at the very heart of our yearning for light. Well, I want to look at two poems, an early poem and a late poem. This one from a collection that Kayleen already referred to. These poems Rilke wrote upon returning from his first trip to Russia in 1899. He simply called them Die Gebete, the prayers, and inscribed them in a black journal book, which he gave to Lou, a handwritten manuscript. He eventually asked to have them back so that he could create a larger book. Padre referred to this earlier on, which he came to call the Book of Hours. So these poems are from part 1 of the Book of Hours. And this poem, when I first read it, did something to me that has never stopped happening. It's a kind of as close to something like a creed, I think, as anything Rilke ever wrote. And he's writing this in his early 20s. He's 24 years old when he writes this poem, which begins with a disclaimer, which holds within it, I think, something we all feel so intensely in this hurried life, this bustled life that has become, for most of us, our day-to-day experience. My life is not this steep hour in which you see me hurrying so. And the image is just a poignant one. Mein Leben ist nicht diese steile Stunde, he writes, this steep hour. And I don't know what that conjures for you, a steep hour. But something we feel is out of control. And whatever that is that's out of control is not who we are. Well, the poem goes on with a series of affirmations, with these great I am claims that are found all through Rilke's writing. And here we see, I am a tree standing before what I once was. An image that seems strange at first and is strange. Rilke had something with trees, and Pádraig, you pointed to a magnificent poem where he turns to trees to remind us slumberously, these slumberous trees towering above us. But this image that our truest identity, no matter what pressures we feel, is that somehow there's this mystery that each of us is a tree, like a tree, rooted, grounded, standing before what we once were. I'm only one of my many mouths. And at that, the first to close. Another one of those moments in Rilke that we instinctively recognize that each of us has many mouths. The mouth that we have as a partner, as an intimate partner, as a friend, as a colleague, as a neighbor. All of these ways that we express ourselves, but that there's one mouth that is the truest to who we are, and that's the first to close. The mouth that gives us a space to listen, that refuses to simply chatter on and on. I am the stillness between two notes that don't easily harmonize. Because the note death wants to lift itself up. But in the dark interval, both come trembling to join as one. And the song remains beautiful. As Meg mentioned, I'm just back from almost a month in Australia and spent 6 days leading a silent retreat north of Melbourne in Victoria, really shaped by this poem. And the retreat took as its title, and the song remains beautiful. This final line, und das Lied bleibt schön. And what I love about this poem is that it begins with what we experience, the frantic nature of our lives, the hurried pressures that we feel outside of us, and that we internalize, this stress that we feel, this anxiety that we're not enough, that we're not clever enough, smart enough, beautiful enough, whatever enough to manage our lives. And then this sense that, in some sense, the song remains beautiful no matter what is happening within us or around us. And that our lives, in some sense, are always shaped by the realities of those pressures and the invitation to discover in that dark interval, and it's a magnificent metaphor, isn't it? In the dark interval, both of these notes the note death and the note life or love or hope or joy, whatever it is that you feel is over against death, that lifts us up against the pressure of death. The dark interval is the place where our lives happen. That's the place, in a sense, where Rilke realizes that we come home to who we are, not by eliminating death, which we can't do, or eliminating suffering, which is impossible, or eliminating darkness, which is itself, for Rilke, the place of creativity, the place of the unconscious, the place of that kind of astonishing startlement that happens to us when we feel the surge of life against everything that speaks against it. And the song remains beautiful. Well, again, from Letters to a Young Poet, a short quote, and then we'll turn to that last poem. And think of this as an invitation for you today. Think of the world you carry within yourself. Think of the world you carry within. He's writing this to a younger poet. Rilke was only in his late 20s when he wrote these letters to Franz Capus, who was 19 when Franz Capus first wrote to this established poet now, Rilke, to ask him if he, Franz, had what it took to become a poet. And Rilke reminds him from the very beginning, don't look outside yourself for affirmation. You have to go into the heart of who you are. Go deep in yourself and find there the path that you're longing to find, that you'll never find outside of yourself. So think of the world you carry within yourself and call this way of thinking by whatever name you wish. Doesn't matter. And whether this comes as recollections of your childhood or as a yearning for your own future, pay attention only to what arises within you and set this above everything else you notice around you. It seems a strange thing to hear, particularly after the marvelous way that both you, Pádraig, and you, Kayleen, have helped us realize how attentive Rilke was to the outside world, how he looked at things, how he saw the connections with the world around us. And I think that this is not a contradiction in a way. He's telling us that the things attending to what's within us opens us to the world outside of us. It connects us. It's the only way that we can find a kind of coherence in our lives. And that's what leads him to say that really our task is to live everything in our life, not simply to try to solve the questions with premature solutions. But this paying attention to what arises within you. I want to look finally at a poem that revolves around these I am statements. It's the very last of the Sonnets to Orpheus. This is from the My New Translation. And it begins with this wonderful line, which many translators have stumbled on, but Rilke is very clear in what he says here. Quiet friend of the many distances. Stiller Freund der vielen Fernen. Quiet friend of the many distances. And what are those distances? What distances do we befriend within us? Not the ones around us, but the ones within us. Kayleen, you're opening us to consider how powerful the journey into grief can become for us. Feel how your breath expands the room. Feel how your breath creates spaciousness around you. Let yourself ring out among the rafters of dark belfries. And suddenly he envisions that each of us is like a bell, ringing out in the rafters, these old beams that are inside of the dark belfries he would have known. That which depletes you will become a strength through this nourishing. Go out and in again in transformation. What's your deepest experience of suffering? If drinking is bitter to you, become wine. Be in this night of excess, magic power at the crossroad of your senses, meaning of their strange encounter. And if what is earthly has forgotten you, say to the quiet earth, I flow. To the rushing waters speak, I am. We could spend a long time with this poem. And I'd like to invite Kayleen and Pádraig back into the conversation. Thinking about this poem, there's such a complex richness in the poem. And at the very end of this long sequence of poems, these sonnets to Orpheus that Rilke wrote, he ends with this sense of, in a sense, touching back on something of the grief, Kayleen, that you brought to our minds and you're sharing. If what is earthly has forgotten you, if you feel so alone in your life, if you feel so shadowed in your experience, how do we live with that? And Rilke gives these two simple invitations, really. Say to the quiet earth, I flow, ich rinne. To the rushing waters speak, ich bin, I am. I flow and I am. In spite of all that I might be feeling in my life, all that depletes me, all that seems to rob me of my strength, weight me down with my suffering, that this is not so much a call to change the world around us, but to indwell our lives differently. So let me invite you both, Pádraig and Kayleen, to reflect on this poem with me.
Those last two lines for me are really a call, an invitation to actually be in relationship with nature. I mean, to address the earth, to address the water, not as an inert thing, but as something that's in part of the conversation with you. And that the healing, I think this is one reason why people like Joanna Macy and Anita Burroughs were so drawn to Rilke, is that connection between non-attachment that the poem also points to go in and out of transformation, and its deep relationship to ecology and nature. And what it really evokes for me is the scene of Rilke and Lou Andrea Salome walking barefoot through the forest. I love that she taught him how to do that. And so I just have this image of them walking, side by side on pine needles, going down to the river. And I feel like it was something that he's not just writing about. I think that he probably lived this, I feel like very much that this was a lived experience. That when his grief perhaps overwhelmed him, I know certainly for me, when grief overwhelms me, going out into nature and letting nature speak and being in relationship with that is enormously healing. And that also pulls us back to the whole myth of Orpheus, who could divert rivers from their courses and who could make the lion and the lamb lay down in harmony with one another. That the whole part of this is such a perfect ending poem for the cycle of sonnets of Orpheus to evoke that myth again.
Beautiful. Yeah. Pádraig.
I was so struck reading this with the imperatives in it. I think there's 6. Feel how your breath, let yourself ring out, go out and in again, become wine, be in this night of excess mystery, and then say to the quiet earth, or just say. And what's so interesting is that there is such recognition of pain in it. What is your deepest experience of suffering? God Almighty. Like, we'd be here all night, all year, all century for all of us to give space to what that is. And he allows the chasm of that to be there, and he doesn't give a certitude of of how to explain it or how to put it away. I think there is, however, a containment in these imperatives. There's such wise offering of these things. Let yourself ring out. And he speaks about the repetitious nature of grief. Go out and in again. And become wine. Wine comes from bruising, and time, and aging, and being in some kind of cavern or cellar. And be in this night of excess mystery. There is a deep recognition of the necessity to find in the midst of uncontainable pain some kind of containment, and I think he holds that in these imperatives. I loved what you said earlier on, Mark, about that the question of who am I, in the face of all of these things, and I flow and I am. Because often what we might ask is, what is this pain? What is this grief? What is this, And he's just speaking about something that is moving, I flow, and something that somehow is a declaration of the self. I find it deeply, deeply moving. And I find it to be, I don't know that poems should be advice, but somehow this speaks to advice in a way that isn't constricting, but is containing.
Oh, that's beautifully said. I think Rilke, this kind of a poem like this is so suited to these moments we're living through in the world around us. A world that seems to be spinning out of any order, out of any sense of harmony and decency and respect. And I think Rilke would say, well, before you frustrate yourself in trying to do things, to change things that you can't change, think of yourself, ground your own life, root your own life in something that is living, that is flowing, and that you are a part of this. In a sense, to say I flow and I am is such a world away from the moments of distress that the poem is shaped by, really. The agony of suffering and the depletion that we feel at the hands of pressures that are upon us. So yeah, it's a remarkable poem. It's one of the shifts that Rilke did. This originally was not the last poem, but he moved it to the last poem, I think, because this poem needs to be his last word, which ends with this strong, simple sentence, Ich bin, I am. Sometimes that's all we can say, right? In the face of this life, this world, its tragedies, its absurdities, its violences, that we can always say, I am, and ground ourselves in that.
Mark, just because it's so rare to have an opportunity to ask a translator this question, I noticed that you had a variation on the way it appears in this book on the slide, and that in this book it says, in the vastness of this night, and on the slide it said, be in this night of excess. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, no translation is ever finished because in a sense it's always an approximate dance. You're trying to create an experience. Rilke said poems are experiences. They're not feelings, they're experiences. How do you create an experience similar in English to the experience that a German reader, a reader reading in German, would have in their native tongue? And there is no way to really render that line. And in Dieser Nacht aus Übermaß, it's a sense of excessiveness that is always present to us as well. And that's what I'm groping for. So yeah, every time I come to this poem, or any of them really, there are always going to be little changes.
I love that. I love that you keep it fluid and open to what's speaking to you right now.
Yeah, and that's with translation, and you're both working with translation as well. There is no finished way of writing a poem first of all, of the poet writing the poem. There's never a sense that you can say, well, this is completely perfect, right? There comes a point where you let go of it and say, well, it has to be now a poem for others. It belongs to them now, to the readers, and they'll do with it what they need to do with it. So, but I find myself as a translator dancing with that same, not challenge, well, it is a challenge, but an invitation to, in a sense, open a world in a poem to the world in the readers who come to that poem with expectancy, with fear, with longing, with uncertainty, all those things. Now, Pádraig, you live between languages.
Yeah, I mean, there's a space of some kind of creative empty that occurs in the space between them all, and that it's continuingly making and unmaking and remaking itself in trying to figure that out. And I think that's true in all acts of translation. And like what I'm doing right now is to translate somehow something that I'm feeling, and I feel like I'm feeling it somewhere in the back of my head into language. That too is an act of translation, even if it's not between two formal languages or three or whatever we're working with. It is it's an act of translating an experience, an event that's occurring into language that's always pointing beyond itself. And as you say, therefore, there's, and I, as Kayleen said so nicely, that's a dance, and the dance is always reciprocal.
Yeah, that's so true. We're visiting my daughter and her family, my 18-month-old granddaughter, and to watch her stumbling toward language, but she does it with her whole body, with her hands, with her eyes, all of these gestures that are, well, they're not yet quite verbal the way we think of language, but they're translating the world of experience into connection, which is what a poem at its best is doing, translating the world of experience into a connection that creates a community.
And there's real discernment in that too, because, there will be language that your granddaughter will reach to as years go by, but there will also be body language that you've been doing this since you were young, way before you had the idea of language to describe language. There are ways that she has of engaging with the world that will continue on in the language of the body. And that, in some sense, is like a pure language.
Absolutely. Well, Kayleen, last thoughts before we turn this over back to Meg.
Mark, can I ask a question here?
Yes.
You recently, I think, visited for the first time where Rilke spent the last years of his life. How did that impact you as a translator and as your understanding of his poetry?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I'd never been to Rouen, the Sierre, where he spent the last 5 years of his life. In a way, it was he lived longer there than he had in any place since his childhood in Prague, because he moved around. He was an itinerant. He never had a place that he called home for more than a year or 2 years. Paris for a couple of spells. But it was a remarkable experience, I have to say, to go. This is in the Upper Rhone Valley in Switzerland, in one of the French cantons of Switzerland. And he chose as his burial place a little village church on a high bluff, a Burgkapelle. It was part of a chapel built in the middle of a castle, a medieval castle. The castle is now, for the most part, gone. But from the place where he's buried, when you look down the valley with steep mountains on either side and vineyards everywhere, vineyards right up to the church itself, you have a sense of spaciousness and yet the grandeur of the mountains, the solidity of the mountains, but the spaciousness of this view. And, there's always something about being in a place, in your body, in a place where somebody else lived a part of their life. So that was profoundly moving for me. And I think what it evoked in me a sense of where Rilke found the solitude that he desired to finish these elegies that he started in 1912. And then came the war, which tore his life apart and tore Europe apart. He stopped writing poetry almost completely for 5 years. And it was looking for a place where he found that kind of solitude is the word that he used. Einsamkeit is a German word. it can mean loneliness, it can mean aloneness, and it can mean solitude. And for him, the sense of being in that place gave him the quiet that he needed to finish this great work, the elegies, and unexpectedly these 55 sonnets came. So yeah, thanks for asking. It was a very moving experience to be there and to feel the kind of quiet beauty of the place of his resting, the place of his burial. As we sat by the grave, people who biked up on their afternoon bike ride, whatever, sort of walked around the church taking pictures, and no one really stopped to look at the grave. It was just another grave, but it's all by itself on one side of the church. There's nobody else buried next to him. But there was something that was appropriate about that as well. I think Rilke didn't want to be fussed over. He felt that his work was his gift, not his bodily life. And so even that to me was a kind of quiet appropriateness and beauty. Thanks for the
Thank you.
question.
Thank you for bringing us there, Mark. That was lovely.
And you know, maybe we close with this. I mean, he wrote this puzzling little poem shortly before he died that he wanted to have inscribed on the stone marker, which it is. It's a very simple grave with his name, no years on the stone, but just this poem, which goes like this. Well, I should add, he was dying of leukemia. He didn't know that until 10 days before his death. But a few months before he died, he was an avid gardener. He loved gardening, and he was trying to cultivate the roses around this little castle, this little stone tower, where he spent those 5 years in a little village called Raron in the canton of Valais or Valais in Switzerland. He pricked his hand, and it didn't heal, and it became infected. And he was quite convinced that his love of the roses, in a sense, brought about his death. It's certainly not medically what happened, but it's how he understood it. And so he wrote this little poem that goes like this. Rose, oh pure contradiction. Delight to be no one's sleep under so many eyelids. And that opening line, Rose, oh pure, oh Rainer Widerspruch is the German, so you hear his name, it's spelled differently, but you hear Rainer Marie Rilke, pure. Rainer spelled with an EI, not the AI of his name, means pure. But begins, Rose, oh pure contradiction. And there's something marvelous about that. The rose, which is an exquisite flower. And for him, it's also a flower that brought pain, that pricked him, that he felt was what killed him finally. And there's something about that
That's
wovenness
perfect.
of beauty and pain.
Beauty and death, beauty and
Beauty
pain
and death.
at the same time, not separate.
That's right. And for Rilke, I think that's one of the reasons we keep going back. I keep going back to Rilke. I think many do, because he didn't erase pain or deny suffering, or ennoble it either as some kind of an independent category. Now, he brings those things close together. That's why we keep coming back to him.
And he enables us to hold them, the contradictions of beauty and terror, as he says in one place, or beauty and dread, right?
Yeah.
And I think, I'm thinking about our upcoming program next week, Mark, where we're going to, next weekend, talking about how his words enabled Eddie Hillesum to bear with unbearable things in World War II. That it was just a thread that those two things, and his words enable us to make enough spaciousness, a word we've used a few times, enough spaciousness in our heart to hold it all.
Yeah. Eddie Hillesum, who took 2 books with her to Auschwitz, a Bible and the Book of Hours, Rilke's Book of Hours. Amazing.
Yeah.
Pádraig, the last word.
I don't have any last words. I'm just so each time we do this,
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, like one of the things that Rilke does is when he looks to God, he asks the question of who am I? And one of the things that happens, I think, when we look to Rilke's work is I too am brought into this strange mystery. Not the eye of my biography, where I'm from, what I do, but the eye of existence, and the eye of ensoulment, and the eye of what does it mean to be able to say the word I and hear myself say it. So there it is. I mean, Rilke's work is so generative because the self that I find myself listening to is a self that's looking beyond itself too. I find it very uplifting, and so I'm so glad to Meg and to you, Mark, and to be with you in this, Kayleen, having been together elsewhere in the United States before. It is so nice to be together in this now.
Yeah.
I
My
want to
thanks to
thank all
both of you.
three of you. Yeah, but Mark, you can say your thanks, but I want to say thank you to all three of you. This is just such a wonderful, deeply healing place in a dark time of year, right? Thank you for doing that.
Mhm.
And I want to
Yeah.
thank everybody for coming. It's wonderful turnout.
Yeah. Well, blessings to all of you in this season, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, of longer and longer nights, and shorter days. And that too will turn. I think that's important to realize that even that will turn. And we must, I think, lean into if as he writes, if drinking is bitter to you, become wine. Just do it.
Oh, what a
Thanks.
great note to end on. Thank you. Thank you
Thank you,
all.
Padre. Thank you, Kayleen.
Thank you, Mark.